Hello, I'm Pia Renada. Welcome to Rappler Talk. Today we speak with Pulse Asia President Ronnie Holmes about President Rodrigo Duterte's popularity ratings, his survey ratings, satisfaction ratings all throughout his 6 year term as we assess how his presidency has impacted the country. So this is one in a series of interviews all about Duterte's legacy and what we can learn from it, what we can see or what patterns we can establish from those 6 years that have passed. So thank you so much, Dr. Holmes, for joining us today.
Hi, good afternoon, Pia.
Yes, okay. So, ito no, interesting because of course we know that in a few weeks' time, Rodrigo Duterte will be stepping down from the presidency. So ngayon we're just trying to wrap our heads around the 6 years that have passed and what exactly this has meant for the country. And one thing that lots of people have been saying about the Duterte presidency every year, no, we always see a discussion point, which is his survey rating. And of course, we know Pulse Asia has been a big part of this, right? You were the ones releasing regular surveys all about his approval ratings, his satisfaction, also like the most urgent concerns that Filipinos are looking at year in, year out. And so, we want to assess this, no? And is it correct that the last survey that we saw was the December 2021 survey where Rodrigo Duterte garnered a 72% approval rating? He, I think, was the most trusted public official, tied with Senate President Tito Soto. But a few months ago, before that, September 2021, there was a drop in Filipinos' approval of how his government handled a string of issues, from criminality, inflation, even the pandemic. So, siguro first question, Dr. Holmes, given all of the 6 years worth of surveys you've seen so far, what can we say about Duterte's presidency now?
Well, we can say generally that Filipinos have been appreciative of the president's performance, and for the most part, on many issues, except for the most important issues, the administration has gotten majority approval in terms of addressing those issues. So, with respect to the more urgent issues, such as the prices of commodities, that is one area where the
Mhm.
administration has been getting less than majority approval, more
Mm.
specifically in the last few surveys that we've had since, let's say, early last year or February 2021. But on the other issues like fighting criminality, it's always been a significant majority approving of the president's performance.
And actually, no, I remember that inflation has actually been a sticky issue for any president. Like, it's not just Duterte who's had a hard time getting approval for how he's handled inflation. But yun, siguro, how would you compare Duterte's satisfaction or approval ratings, trust ratings with those of the presidents who have gone before him?
It's been at the higher end in terms of the approval ratings. We've had performance rated four presidents since Pulse Asia was established in 1999. Those will be President Estrada, Arroyo, Aquino, and Duterte. And in that span of time, President Duterte's approval ratings have been the highest, gross ratings at least, that we've seen. His last approval rating, if I'm not mistaken, is about at the low. This is the March 2022. I think it was at about 73% PIA. So
Mm-hmm.
as he ends his term, his approval is still a significant majority, 3 out of 4 Filipinos. Compared to, let's say, the previous president, when Noynoy Aquino, the late Noynoy Aquino, ended his term, the last approval we got was about 45%. So it's been somehow better, much better for President Duterte in terms of the level of approval or trust of the public.
So could we say right now, with him ending his term, that he is the most popular post-EDSA president we've had? Would you say that?
Yes, at least based on our surveys, he has had his approval ratings have been consistent and trust ratings have been consistently high, majority. We have not seen him dip to less than a majority. We've seen two occasions when his approval ratings declined, both in September 2018, when we were faced with the increasing prices of basic commodities, and then in September 2021, when we had a surge also of COVID cases. But
Mm.
it dipped only to what, about 64%, if I'm not mistaken. That was the lowest that he had. He has
Mm.
not had any lower than majority approval and trust compared to previous presidents.
Mhm. I'm sure you get this all the time, but it's worth asking again since we already ending the term of the president. What would you attribute to these higher than usual or higher than you've seen ratings for a president? Why does Duterte still command that kind of trust rating, approval rating?
Well, I think at the earlier period, I would say that it will be primarily because the president has been what almost constantly present in terms of projecting what he was doing. I
Mm,
think Pia, you were covering the president from that time. No, you were not yet barred from presidential
yes.
coverage, at least physically, and he would frequently be responding to media. Even during the pandemic, you've had those weekly appearances of the president. So this is a president that doesn't shy away from media coverage. And in that regard, I think his mere presence basically presents that image that he's doing his job. Although
Mm,
some people will question whether he is doing his job, that the projection really is that he is constantly working on fulfilling the functions of the presidency because he is always on the move and whatever he does is captured by media and media reports.
mm. Okay, so he's very good at projecting like decisive leadership. It's also something that I've heard other analysts say, no, yung kanyang decisive leadership is something Filipinos appreciate and see because nga he's always on TV, he's always making the news, right, with his
Yeah,
controversial statements. I mean, they're controversial, but they also get the headlines, and so that also attracts attention. But there's
yeah.
also a question. Yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Pia.
Oh, I wanted rin a corollary to that whole issue of yung high approval ratings. People people questioning if there are other factors that could explain those high ratings. And uh, I recall interviews you've done in the past where you mentioned a fear factor that can't be discounted. And you even said that Pulse Asian sometimes notes but does not publicize mga non-verbal behavior like respondents taking a long time to answer the survey, or like they observe the survey takers, the enumerators, maybe warily or something. So I just want to ask you again, like for the record, like after all of these years of surveys, can you still say that fear factor cannot be discounted?
Yeah, I would say that fear cannot be discounted, but whether it's a significant proportion, it will afflict a
Mm,
significant proportion of the respondents. That's something that cannot in any way be established. In the earlier periods when we were mindful of the nonverbal behavior of respondents and we're taking note of this, we did not see that much of an apprehension. I mean, nonverbal behavior that will indicate apprehension or reservation in terms of answering questions. One of the indicators that we normally use to see whether there is resistance towards participating in surveys would be the outright refusal on the part of prospective respondents. We have not seen an increase in terms of outright refusals when you identify the respondent and they say they don't want to be interviewed without
mm,
really stating the reason. So in that case, I think to a significant extent, I think many of the responses will be indicative of the sentiment of the respondents as to what would influence those sentiments.
mm.
Those are the things that, of course, we can second guess it, but those are not
Mm.
the things we normally probe into.
I'm wondering if Pulse Asia was able to look into the impact of social media on survey ratings, because right after Duterte, right, we have an elections where we saw the first majority vote for a president, and we also know how social media was such an important aspect of this election. So, have there been any discussions about that?
We have not really looked into what the effect is, but if you cost tabulate, let's say, the responses in terms of access to the internet,
Mm,
whether they read the news from the internet and approval ratings of the president, there's not much of a variance. So that means that in that regard, when people say that they have access to the internet, the level of approval of the president is almost the same as those who don't have
mm,
access to the internet. What we do know from our surveys is that access to the internet has more or less remained the same. About 7 out of 10 Filipinos have
mm,
access to the internet. in the most recent survey that we conducted in March, we found out that, from about 1 out of 3 reading news about the elections through the internet, reading, watching, or listening to news about the elections in the internet. This was in September 2021. It
Mm-hmm.
went up to 2 out of 3 in March
Mm-hmm.
2022. That means more people were attentive and knowing the news about the elections from the internet. Unfortunately, Pia, we did not prove as to what segment of the internet, but in terms of global data, that basically shows it's more social media than the news websites, right? So I don't know how much disinformation or truthful information you would find on social media with respect to the elections.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned no the ability of Duterte to project a certain type of leadership kind of partially explains his high ratings, but I'm also wondering if Pulse Asia was able to see if any specific policy, program, or action that he did also contributed in a big way to his ratings.
One of the things that we established quite early was the level of support for the campaign against illegal drugs, or the drug war,
Mm.
Pia. From the start in September 2016, we noted and we reported this out that you have about 9 out of 10 Filipinos supporting the drug war. The ones who say that they truly support the drug war, despite already some controversies surrounding the drug war, then about close to 1 out of 2 Filipinos, 45%. The ones who said that they somewhat support the drug war was also about 1 out of 2 Filipinos. So you basically
Mm.
have almost universal support for the drug war, and this has been consistent across the
Mm.
years, despite the apprehensions raised in prior surveys that they might be victimized by extrajudicial killings. So I think that's one of the reasons for the earlier support. In our more recent surveys, we find that there is actually more significant support for the drug war, maybe because the casualties have not as much been reported compared to the earlier
Mm.
period. But that's one thing. This is the campaign, or the campaign anchored itself, right? Essentially eliminating the proliferation of illegal drugs. So that was at the earlier point. And we have not seen any change in terms of the level of support for the drug war across the surveys from 2016 until 2022.
We also see no, through the years that there are certain survey questions and the answers to them, then you compare them to Duterte's approval ratings, parang may be something kind of contradictory. For example, like most Filipinos would agree that the West Philippine Sea Hague ruling should be asserted. And then during that time, Duterte was always saying, na, "Oh, not yet time," parang time playing kind of the soft approach to China, but he still had high approval ratings. And then COVID-19, we know that his ratings dropped a bit, but 'di ba parang and yet nasa-survive niya 'yon. And marami pang ganung issues na like for example, a majority of Filipinos believe that it's dangerous to publish news, but 'di ba parang they still support Duterte or still
Yeah.
approve of his governance. So how would you explain that in a way contradiction or I don't know, like hard to explain kind of gap?
Actually, it's not so much of contradiction. Remember, Pia, we were criticized when we released the performance rating, the first survey we came out with during the pandemic, when the
Mm.
third approval rating, if I can
Ah,
recall, 90%,
91. Yeah, yeah.
90, 91%. And people were saying, how can a president who did not do well, at least this is from the perspective of those who were critical about the president's performance during the early days of the pandemic, get such a high rating? The same survey was able to establish that the area where people were more satisfied with regard to the government's response were two areas. Essentially, one was preventing the spread of the pandemic. Of course, we all know that the spread was global, and I think
Mm.
the approach taken by government, which is a little bit more militaristic, may be regarded as more or less a strong approach towards preventing the spread of the pandemic, despite the fact that there were criticisms that he did not close the border that early.
Mm.
The second reason behind the approval at that time was really the disbursement of the social remuneration program, the ayuda.
Mm. Mhm.
And this would also explain the drop in his approval rating in September 2021 when we had a renewed surge, but there was no ayuda ready being provided. So
Mm.
it seems that that was something uh, That was the basis for the approval then. Now, on that one, for example, on the territorial integrity, we know while the president's approval is high, the national administration's performance on defending the territorial integrity has been middling. It's not as high
Mm.
as the presidential approval. The last time we did a performance rating of the performance of the administration defending territorial integrity, I think it was less than a majority who were approving.
Mm.
So people are able to discriminate the performance of the administration versus the performance of the president. And it seems that the level of the expectation with regard to the president will be relatively much more general than, let's say,
Mm.
some people are more attentive to some issues and they tend to point out that the performance has been wanting, let's say, on inflation, on reducing poverty, and even on the defense of the territorial integrity of the country.
Mhm. So, meron ganyang personal connection, I guess, that allows Duterte to have a resilient approval rating. If you were, like, for example, advising a politician, like, what can they learn? What can maybe even future presidents learn from how resilient Duterte's ratings have been through the years?
I think basically it's your presence, the presence of the access to the president, the ability of the president to project himself as being present, as always being there. There are occasions in the past when you get on Twitter, at least, which is just a small proportion of Filipinos on Twitter, you find the hashtag nasa ng pangulo, but more often
Mhm.
than not the president has been present, Pia, no.
Mhm.
And I think this is one thing that you can more or less differentiate this president from all the previous presidents. In the earlier period, I remember the president was there at any time during a calamity, or even when, let's say, a law enforcer or a military. During the Marawi siege, he was visiting some of the injured soldiers. So he
Mhm.
was basically showing himself as someone who had empathy.
Mhm.
So, and this is the personal element that the president has been able to project, quite successfully, and may have contributed to the maintenance of his approval and trust rating.
Mhm. But beyond talk of his popularity, because it's established he has high ratings consistently, but is this level of popularity in a president good or bad for democracy?
It's both. It's essentially good and bad. It's good because the people would basically think that the president is doing his work. It's bad if you look at what the president has done in terms of strengthening institutions, and yet he is getting this type of approval rating. By strengthening institutions, I mean, for example, has this president been someone who has championed really the independence of media? Or has the
Mm.
president been involved in terms of really being hypercritical of certain media and even to a certain extent silence the media, either directly or indirectly? So, in that sense, when the president gets an approval rating, despite the fact that certain acts or decisions are illiberal, then that's bad for democracy because the approval is an indication of an acceptance of such illiberal action.
Mm. Mhm. So, yun rin yung isang contradiction because we live in a democracy. So you assume that, diba, Filipinos would appreciate like democratic freedoms, but this is belied by the fact that Filipinos approve of someone who to many people appears to threaten these very freedoms and institutions. So how would you explain that? Like why that disconnect?
It is that there's a certain segment of the public which would really be comfortable with certain compromises with respect to fundamental liberties. So, for example, what is given much more value would be one's personal safety. And if what is needed in order to secure one's personal safety is that certain liberties of people who might commit certain offenses,
Mm.
or due process is something that is really impinged on. So between those, some Filipinos may value more their personal safety than the adherence of government to, let's say, a fundamental principle in democracy, which is due process.
Mm.
So I think the explanation given by some social scientists is that some Filipinos are in favor of a what one sociologist called a disciplining democracy. Uh,
Mm.
so they still believe that our liberties should be protected, but when it comes to people who violate the rights or liberties of others, they should be disciplined.
Mm. Another effect of the high approval ratings for the president is the tendency of his spokesmen and his allies to always bring it up as a way sometimes to even swat criticisms, no, na parang like for example when you say, oh, he's doing this, he's doing that, it's bad for certain groups, it threatens democracy, but they will always say, look at his approval ratings, they're high. So in a way, the subtext is he can do no wrong, or your criticisms don't matter, the grievances don't matter. As someone who heads a poll firm, what do you think of that?
Well, that's one thing that we get from public opinion polls. Essentially, sometimes, Pia, I mean, there are occasions when we don't agree with the public opinion that we collect. But it basically means that our appreciation of what government has done, or specifically what the president or any official or performance rating has done, is quite different. No? The basis, let's say, when people approve, for example, of the president's performance, let's say on fighting criminality,
Mm,
despite the draconian measures, it only shows that there may be some structural infirmities that people are very familiar with. That they think that these measures are necessary at this point, unless until those infirmities are resolved. Um, so it may be temporal, but it basically what we need to understand, why is it that people think this way? Why is it that this is the opinion that people express in the survey? Is it a function of fear? Is it a function of the limitations of certain institutions that should actually
mm,
operate much more smoothly and effectively? And because they did not operate effectively, people have become frustrated and are willing to cling on or accept certain practices that are essentially undemocratic.
mm, mm. And what does Duterte's popularity mean for the next administration? Because it's gonna be a tough act to follow for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. No, to parang sustain that kind of presidential popularity that Duterte enjoyed for most of his term. What does that mean for expectations for Marcos, especially given his the votes that he was able to get in the elections?
Well, yes, there's something that's quite distinct between the incoming president and the outgoing president. The outgoing president had less than 40% of the popular vote. The
Mm,
incoming one has close to 60% of the popular vote, without prejudice to settling questions about fraud or any other things. But the point here is that you've got a president, the first president who has majority support. It will be difficult to see a lower approval for this president, at least in the first few surveys. But
mm,
whether this president can sustain it will depend largely on certain conditions and actions that he would undertake that will testify to his commitment to some of the general promises that he stated during the campaign. Promises of unity and the promise of having the country recover quite expeditiously from what hit us, no, the pandemic. So it will really depend on his performance because the difference between the President-elect Marcos and President Duterte is that President Duterte had very clear campaign promises, and
mm,
at the outset he said that I could not meet them. And despite, after just a few months, he said I could not meet the 3 6 month target.
mhm,
People
mhm,
appreciated that honesty,
mm,
and kept his approval rating. Now let's see how effective the president-elect would communicate. We've seen the effectiveness of his campaign strategy that netted this result. Let's see whether they would be as effective when they get into the position.
mhm. Okay. Last question, Dr. Holmes. No, as we end the term of the president, and we see that the popularity he has gained has also, in a way, emboldened even certain actions of the president that may endanger democracy. What would you think? What do you think? Society, how should society view or use or approach the popularity of an official? Like, is it dangerous to be that popular, and how can we guard against whatever dangers that such power could give to an official?
It basically tells us, that when it comes to communication, you've got the president or government communicating, but there are many other sources of information. It essentially tells us that the other sources of information, the other potential institutions that can improve on civic and political education, are not as effective as, let's say, the tools that have been used by government or by politicians in order to shore up their image. So we need to work on institutions that will really promote greater regard for fundamental civil liberties and political rights, and that will also motivate people to engage in governance. Because somehow we don't see that so far. We see largely a population that just observes, pretty much. We would want to see a population that will actively engage themselves in governance and politics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holmes, for your insights. We at Rappler will continue to be watching the last few days of the Duterte administration, and we will continue to be assessing his impact on our country. Once again, I'm Pierre Nada here for Rappler Talk. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.